All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're unpacking one of the most explosive and heavily debated periods in modern European history. We're talking about the 1970s West German urban guerrilla movement, led primarily by the notorious Red Army faction, or RAF. Today we're cutting straight through the media myths that totally paralyzed a nation, and we're digging into the dark, forensic realities of an event that people are still arguing about today. We'll be looking directly at historical documents, academic analysis, and the raw physical evidence to figure out what actually went down during the so-called Red Decade.
To really get a feel for the massive media panic happening in West Germany at the time, just listen to this quote from journalist Jürgen Offenbach in 1976. He asked, "What has made the female element in the terror scene so strong and shoved the men into the background?" Now, you have to understand, this wasn't some fringe conspiracy theory. This was a total mainstream obsession. The media, and even top state officials, were literally fixated on the women in these militant groups. They were pushing this wild theory that all this political violence was the direct result of, get this, an excess of women's liberation. The societal backdrop here is absolutely crucial because, it highlights something we actually still see happening today. When society goes through huge cultural shifts, the establishment often projects its deepest fears onto highly visible outgroups. And West Germany, it was going through some massive changes. The feminist movement was taking off, birth control was suddenly everywhere, and the conservative establishment basically felt like the traditional nuclear family was under direct attack. So when female left-wing radicals started bombing buildings, the media didn't just see terrorists. No, they saw these domineering, anarchist Amazons. They linked this extreme violence directly to feminism, framing the whole thing as this crazy biological and cultural rebellion.
Let me give you a really fascinating example from our sources to bring this to life. Have you heard of Ulrike Meinhof? She was actually a highly respected left-wing journalist. She even wrote a TV film called Bombule. It was all about the horrible conditions and a subsequent uprising inside a girls' reform school. The crazy part, it was supposed to be broadcast to the entire German nation in May of 1970. But it was abruptly pulled, canceled and locked in a vault for decades. Why? Because literally just 4 days before it was supposed to air, Meinhof took part in an armed raid to break a convicted arsonist named Andreas Baader out of police custody. It is such a wild story, and it drops us right into the paranoia of the era, That shocking, rapid jump from bourgeois intellectualism straight into underground terror.
But here is where it gets really interesting, because the actual data completely shatters that whole media myth. A 1981 government study looked at arrest warrants from 1978, and guess what? Men still vastly outnumbered women. Only 33% of wanted left-wing radicals were women, compared to 67% who were men. So the media hyperbole conveniently ignored the actual demographics. They were essentially just projecting their own anxieties about a changing society onto this highly visible but statistically minority group of female guerrillas.
See, the media just love to compare these supposedly domineering, hyper-emancipated women with male guerrillas, who they painted as totally weak or effeminate. They were pushing this narrative of a complete gender role reversal. But if you look beneath all that sensationalism, the reality of the underground was a completely different story. The inner circles of these militant organizations were actually defined by incredibly strict patriarchal leadership and really deep-seated misogyny.
In fact, the reality of this supposed feminist utopia is pretty jarring when you hear how Andreas Baader, the unquestioned leader and basically the cult figure of the RAF, actually spoke to his own members. He routinely maintained control through just brutal verbal abuse. According to historical testimony, he used highly degrading terms for the female group members, calling them waiting maids and the plague. So women in the underground definitely were not experiencing some kind of radical liberation. They were stuck in a punishing, heavily paternalistic environment where male dominance was fiercely enforced.
So, what does this all mean? Well, researchers and psychologists who studied these groups concluded that these women definitely weren't acting out in excess of emancipation. Actually, the evidence suggests something much darker. Both the male and female guerrillas were driven by this intense, overwhelming compulsion for collective martyrdom. They weren't really inspired by the women's liberation movement at all. In fact, a lot of them actively mocked feminism as bourgeois. They were way more motivated by this dark, almost religious tradition of self-sacrifice, honestly believing they were giving up everything for this rigid anti-imperialist cause.
And all of this intense ideological fervor built up to an absolute climax in the fall of 1977. It's a period of history now calls the German Autumn. By this point, the core leaders of the RAF, including Baader, Meinhof, and Gudrun Ensslin, had all been captured and locked up. So in a truly desperate attempt to break them out, a second generation of guerrillas kidnapped an industrialist named Hans Martin Schleyer on September 5th. The state refused to negotiate, so things escalated. On October 13th, a Palestinian commando group actually hijacked a Lufthansa airliner to force the prisoners' release. But on October 17th, German special forces stormed the plane in Mogadishu and freed all the hostages. Then the very next morning, October 18th, the core RAF leadership was found dead in their high-security cells at Stamheim prison.
Now, to even begin to grasp the mystery of what actually went down that night, we have to look at the extreme conditions these prisoners were kept in. They were subjected to something called Kontaktsperre, basically a legally enforced state of absolute total isolation. We're talking extreme sensory deprivation. They were completely cut off from the outside world, no contact with their lawyers, and, supposedly, absolutely no way to communicate with each other.
So, keeping that isolation in mind, here is the official narrative from the state. According to authorities, despite the strict Kontaktsperre, the inmates had somehow managed to build a secret communication network using their wall sockets. The state claimed the prisoners learned about the failed hijacking in Mogadishu using hidden radios, and realizing their comrades had failed to bust them out, they allegedly carried out a highly coordinated group suicide. How? Well, the official line is they used weapons that had been secretly smuggled into the maximum security prison by their own defense attorneys during past visits.
But wait, because the physical evidence from the crime scene immediately threw up some massive, glaring contradictions to that neat official story. For example, Andreas Baader was left-handed, right? But he was found shot in the base of his neck, and the recoil powder burns were found on his right hand. Then there's Jan Karl Rosby. He was also found shot, but he had 0 powder burns on his hands, none, which is basically a forensic impossibility if he fired the gun himself. And Gudrun Ensslin, she was found hanged, but the chair she supposedly used was physically too far away from her body for her to have stepped off it. And get this, a 4th prisoner, Irmgard Muller, didn't actually die. She survived with severe stab wounds to her chest.
Now, those physical anomalies are weird enough on their own, but they become incredibly chilling when you look at the warnings the prisoners sent out before all this happened. Gudrun Ensslin had explicitly told her lawyers, and I quote, "I am afraid of being suicided. If there is no letter from me and I'm found dead, in this case it is an assassination." And Andreas Baader sent almost the exact same letter. He warned that the state was trying to provoke suicides, or at least create the plausible appearance of them, and he stated very clearly that absolutely none of them had any intention of killing themselves.
To put a human face on this massive true crime mystery, we really have to look at the testimony of Irmgard Muller, the sole survivor of that night in Stamheim. She has adamantly and consistently maintained for decades that there was no suicide pact whatsoever. Her account is that she simply went to sleep, heard these muffled, explosive-sounding noises during the night, and then woke up hours later completely disoriented and severely injured. She says she definitely didn't stab herself, and she insisted because of their strict isolation, the prisoners had absolutely no idea about the hostage situation in Mogadishu anyway. And all of this leaves us staring at a profound historical fracture. On one hand, you have the state's narrative, fanatical terrorists who chose death over defeat, pulling off a crazy scheme with hidden radios and smuggled guns. But on the other hand, you have this massive mountain of forensic contradictions, explicit prior warnings of murder, and a sole survivor's testimony that points directly toward an extrajudicial execution by the state. The absolute truth of what happened at Stamheim is still locked inside those cells. So what do you think? Was it a desperate, coordinated group suicide, or was it a meticulously covered-up state assassination? It's one of those questions that really forces us to look at the limits of state power during a massive crisis, and I'll leave you to weigh these dark historical contradictions for yourself.